Innsmouth, stranger.
Greetings travellers, and welcome to a very special bonus episode of the Innsmouth Book Club podcast. I'm your host Tim Mendes. Yes, while Rob is away in France looking for the threshold to fabled Malniant, it has been left to me to entertain our guests this week. So to that end, I will be looking at two tomes, one of them real, one of them fictional, both of them entitled Mysteries of the Worm. In fact, you can think of this episode as a kind of addendum or appendix to last week's episode where we looked at Robert Bloch's A Notebook Found in a Deserted House. So, yeah, during that recording, we mentioned the book that it is found in, entitled Mysteries of the Worm from Chaosium, and talked about the appendices in it. And I'm going to be looking at some of those today to glean some information about Robert Bloch and the creation of his mythos tome, De Vermis Mysteris, or The Mysteries of the Worm. There are three appendices that we're going to be looking at today. The first one is an introduction by Robert M. Price, entitled About De Vermis Mysteris. The second one, which I'm going to read in its entirety, is an afterword by Robert Bloch himself. And the third one we're going to dip into a tiny bit is a retrospective by Lin Carter. But first off, we're going to look at the fictional Mysteries of the Worm, De Vermis Mysteris. De Vermis Mysteris basically is Robert Bloch's mythos tome, one of three that he created. We'll have a little look at the other two in a moment. One of them you will know, the other one maybe not so much. But I think it's fair to say that after the Necronomicon, De Vermis Mysteris is probably the second most well-known mythos tome. I think I'm right in saying that. I think it's the second most used. I mean, a lot of people who are into the mythos will know about Unausprechlichen Kulten and Cultus des Ghouls and all that kind of business. But I think this is the one that's, after the Necronomicon, has had the most mainstream usage. It's been in video games, it's been used by Stephen King a lot. I mean, it was in Jerusalem's Lot and the TV adaptation Chapelwaite. So I think if the man in the street, if he knew anything about the mythos whatsoever, he would say after the Necronomicon probably may know De Vermis Mysteris, maybe not, but there you go. If you disagree with that, let me know if you think one of the other ones is more well known. But that's what I kind of think of, but just basically judging on how many other authors have used it. De Vermis Mysteris was written by Ludwig Prinn and is described as a folio-sized printing in black ink over 700 pages long. The earlier of the 16 chapters of the book discuss ghosts, zombies and the like, while latter parts of the book detail the author's travels among the Saracens of Arabia, Egypt, Syria and Libya, and his encounters with jinn and Efreet. Now, there's a lot of material in the book about the summoning and binding of different demons and abominations. And the last chapter allegedly contains the formula for a drug that allows one to travel through space and time, also known as Liao or the Plutonian drug. Now, in reality, the Mysteries of Worm was created by Robert Bloch and first mentioned in the story The Secret in the Tomb. It then featured in a lot of his works. I think it was his most used of his own tomes. Now I'm going to turn now to Robert M. Price and his introduction to The Mysteries of the Worm, the Chaosium collection of Robert Bloch's mythos stories. Each member of the Lovecraft Circle tried his hand at creating a tome worthy of being placed on the shelf alongside H.P. Lovecraft's Necronomicon, and most of them succeeded. In many passages wherein Lovecraft has occasion to mention the Necronomicon, he also notes the presence of Robert E. Howard's Unausprechlichen Kulten, Clark Ashton Smith's The Book of Ibon, and two of Robert Bloch's creations, Cultus des Ghouls and De Vermis Mysteris. Bloch had originally titled the nefarious work simply Mysteries of the Worm, but Lovecraft advised him to spruce it up with a little erudition. From a letter, Lovecraft says, "If Prinn's immortal work is in Latin, you ought to give the title in that language. Hence my change in two places to De Vermis Mysteris, concerning of the worm the mysteries." That letter comes from January the 25th, 1935. So De Vermis Mysteris it became. Price continues talking a little bit about the book itself. What is to be known of the author of De Vermis Mysteries? Fortunately, Bloch was not stingy with the details, and readers got to know Prynne pretty well when he was introduced in The Shambler from the Stars. Prynne was a Flemish knight who marched off to the Holy Land in the Ninth Crusade. At some point he was captured and became a slave of certain Syrian wizards and thaumaturges. Learning their secrets and trafficking with evil spirits, having become a potent sorcerer in his own right, he travelled to Egypt and gave birth to a cycle of legend that spread his reputation across North Africa. His time was spent delving for occult secrets in forbidden tombs. Eventually he returned to his Flemish homeland to pursue his blasphemous studies in a ruined mausoleum dating from Roman times. Surrounded by familiar spirits and conjuring up devilish entities from the stars, he came to grief during the witch trials, being captured and tortured. While awaiting death in his cell, he wrote De Vermis Mysteries. After its posthumous publication, it was everywhere suppressed, but authorities could not prevent fugitive copies from falling into the hands of certain seekers. There are at least 2 editions, the original Latin and an English translation. Later in the introduction, Price talks about the contents of the book. Prynne is depicted mainly as one who deals with spirits, and of course the whole story is heading towards the ill-fated invocation of the Shambler itself. This is concerning the story of the Shambler from the Stars. We also hear of such gods of divination as Father Yig, Dark Han, and serpent-bearded Beatis being mentioned in the text. It is implied that they too could be invoked to reveal their secrets, but the book is also said to contain spells and enchantments. To this, one item of information is added in the Faceless God, namely that Prynne had learned some unspecified knowledge of Nyarlathotep in the course of his travels. So yeah, Bloch developed this over the course of the stories. It's one of those, kind of like the Necronomicon and all of these other things. It kind of developed organically. There was no real... I can't imagine Bloch sitting there and plotting it all out with post-it notes and bits of string, you know what I mean? I think it kind of just evolved naturally over the course of writing. I mean, that's what happens in my work. I mean, the whole idea of the milieu I created and the various things, the tome I created and the great old one I created, none of it was planned. It all just happened and kind of evolved and is still evolving to this day. So yeah, but Bloch used the Mysteries of the Worm quite a lot in stories such as The Secret in the Tomb, The Suicide in the Study, The Grinning Ghoul, Brood of Bubastis, The Secret of Sebek, Fane of the Black Pharaoh. It was quite prolific in Bloch's work. The last appearance of the Mysteries of the Worm in Bloch's work was in the story Filter Tip, but it was referred to as Prynne's Grimoire, in which it actually talks about the not-to-be-named, aka Hastur, and the toad-shaped Sarthogua. So yeah, you can see little bits and pieces being added to it, but that's kind of the circle all over, isn't it? So now, before we read the afterword by Robert Bloch, what we're going to do is quickly dive into the appendices called Demon Dreaded Lore, Robert Bloch's Contribution to the Cthulhu Mythos by Lin Carter. So after an introduction and talk of how Robert Bloch got started in weird fiction and things like that, we get to this little bit here. It was the Flemish wizard Ludwig Prynne and his hellish book De Vermis Mysteries, or Mysteries of the Worm, that became, and that remains, Robert Bloch's major contribution to the lore of the mythos. In his story The Shambler from the Stars, which incidentally he dedicated to Lovecraft and then killed him in it, he builds upon Prynne's life and history and reveals as much as he ever wished to pass on to us of the contents and theme of that ghoulish tome. The volume certainly belongs on the same dusty shelf with Unaussprechlichen Kulten and Der Lieber Divonis. Now before we carry on here, I just want to mention, we've already mentioned De Cults de Ghouls, which is another Robert Bloch creation. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that now is because in one of the next paragraphs, Lin Carter erroneously credits it to August Derleth. Now, that I put down to the fact that it was always credited to De Comte de Erlet, which, as we will see here, is a joke. But yeah, apparently it's a common misconception that Derleth created De Cults de Ghouls, but it wasn't, it was Robert Bloch. Now, a lot of people know about that one, that's quite well known, but what some people don't realise is that Bloch also created another mythos tome that was called Black Rites, and it was first mentioned in The Suicide in the Study in 1935, where a copy is owned by the wizard James Allington, and then it comes up again in The Grinning Ghoul in 1936. So yeah, I think they're the only two appearances of it, but just keep that in mind. Black Rites was another creation of Robert Bloch. Here we go. And back to Lin Carter and his essay. I can no longer refrain from informing you of the hideous truth. Robert Bloch has a sense of humour. Humour and horror have never been so inextricably mixed as in the career of Robert Bloch. If H.P. Lovecraft hadn't encouraged him to contribute to Weird Tales, I have no doubt but that he would have gone on to write material for Fred Allen, Sid Caesar or Bob Hope. Now, the boys in the Lovecraft circle did not, repeat, not, treat their work with any great solemnity. In fact, they delighted in playing jokes on each other in their stories. The Comte de Hurlet, who is the author of Derleth's Cultes des Ghouls, is a Lovecraftian pun on Derleth's own surname, for example. Bloch paid him back on Derleth's behalf. He didn't. It was him that wrote it. Oh dear, Mr. Carter, you got that wrong, didn't you? By making the author of his own Black Rites one Love Carafe. That's brilliant. I'd forgotten about that entirely until I read this. And that's spelt LUVEH-KERAPH. Love Carafe. Brilliant. Adding with, presumably, a straight face that the mad Egyptian was a priest of Bast. To catch that one, you have to know that Lovecraft was crazy about cats. Similarly, Lovecraft inserted into another story a reference to the Comorian myth cycle of the Lantean high priest Clark Ashton, since Clark Ashton Smith wrote tales set in Comorium, capital of his Hyperborea. The joke is obvious. So yeah, we've looked at the creation of the Mysteries of the Worm a little bit, and basically before we go much further, I'll just talk a tiny little bit about this book, even though we covered it in last week's episode. The tome I'm going from is Mysteries of the Worm. I'm going from the 3rd edition, which includes 4 extra stories, so if you are going to pick up a copy of this Chaosium tome, try and get the 2009 edition. Or ones that come after it. Otherwise you'll be missing out on 4 tales, a couple of which are really, really cracking. Right, so now, the meat of today's episode. This is the afterword by Robert Bloch in Mysteries of the Worm. I'm going to read it in its entirety. It was written in 1981. Bloch begins. In July 1934, I looked out. That's when I sold my first story to Weird Tales magazine. To a 17-year-old youngster just graduated from high school in the depths of the Great Depression, this seemed like a miracle. And in a way it was, for The Secret in the Tomb barely qualified as a story at all. Editor Farnsworth Wright must have had an off day when he decided to accept the tale. But it was a great day to me, and thus encouraged, I immediately wrote and submitted another story, The Feast in the Abbey. It too was accepted and I looked at again. For in accordance with some mysterious editorial decision, it was this second effort which was the first to actually appear in print, on November 1st, in an issue predated January 1935. Feast wasn't exactly a masterpiece either, but it was a good cut above the earlier effort, and had a last line which readers seem to remember. Which is more than can be said for Secret, or many of the stories that I wrote and subsequently sold. The Suicide in the Study, The Dark Demon, The Grinning Ghoul, and The Faceless God were experiments, poorly conceived and poorly executed by a teenaged amateur who deserved to be executed himself. My references to the so-called Cthulhu mythos in these efforts clearly indicated that I was under the influence of my literary mentor, H.P. Lovecraft, though the less charitable might also suspect I wrote them under the influence of some hallucinogenic drug. Such, however, was not the case, and every once in a while a genuine story notion would come my way. For example, I conceived the notion of killing off Mr. Lovecraft in a somewhat tongue-in-cheek fashion, with his permission of course. With characteristic generosity he not only granted me that liberty, but set it down in a document signed in 4 languages. And thus I wrote The Shambler from the Stars, dedicated to H.P. Lovecraft, whereupon he returned the courtesy in a sequel, The Haunter of the Dark, with myself as dedicatee and victim. Other experimental ventures, conscious attempts to move away from Lovecraft's literary turf, if not his influence, were my series of Egyptological or Egyptological tales, several of which are included in this collection. And occasionally I came up with an offbeat idea, as in The Mannequin, though at the time I was blissfully unaware that Henry S. Whitehead had utilised a somewhat similar concept in his story Cassius. Rereading these pieces today, some of which have rightfully and mercifully remained out of print for 40-odd years, I find myself reiterating a recurrent regret. Why couldn't some of those ideas waited to occur to me later, when I'd have been better prepared to do justice to them? Truth to tell, I didn't really begin to write properly for nearly a decade following that first sale. Not that I was necessarily any great shakes at it even then, but at last I'd begun to diversify my style and divest it of some annoying mannerisms. The Shadow from the Steeple, the sequel which I eventually added to HPL's Haunter, is deliberately written in the mood and mode of its predecessors and utilises the same milieu. It is, however, much more disciplined and coherent than Shambler, if not necessarily as much fun. And while A Notebook Found in a Deserted House is a throwback to H.P. Lovecraft-influenced tales, it bears little stylistic resemblance to those earlier works with their ponderous and pretentious polysyllabification and pseudo-scholarly references. But these tales, of course, are assembled here together for the first time because of a common denominator. All of them have some connection with the Cthulhu mythos. They are not, I hasten to assure you, stories which were revised or written by H.P. Lovecraft. As a matter of record, although it was Lovecraft who suggested I turn my hand to writing weird fiction, and offered to read and criticise my early efforts, he actually saw only 6 or so of them all told, and of these, several never actually appeared in print. Those that I did inflict on him, he praised rather than criticised, and his suggestions involved minor changes. Gently he corrected errata in spelling or references, but at all times took pains to reassure me that I was a writer rather than an egregious nerd. In a word, he lied like a gentleman. It was HPL who, when I came up with another imaginary book of sorcery to take its place alongside his famous Necronomicon, conferred upon my Mysteries of the Worm its Latin title, and offered me Latin phrases for use as invocations. I've been asked if the name I bestowed on the book's author, Ludwig Prynne, was derived from that of Hester Prynne, heroine of the Scarlet Letter. If so, the association was an unconscious one, for I'd yet to read Hawthorne's novel at the time, and didn't see the silent film version until 2 years ago. Even if I had been familiar with the character, I doubt I'd form any special connection between an adulteress in colonial New England and a European devotee of black magic. Oddly enough, Lovecraft's greatest direct contribution to my work consisted of his suggestions, and some lines of actual rewriting and rephrasing incorporated into Satan's Servants. This is not a mythos tale and is not included herein, as a matter of record. I put it aside following his inspection and didn't complete the story until many years after Lovecraft's death. Lovecraft's death. I hadn't intended to write that phrase, though even today, more than 40 years after the event, it carries a tragic connotation. Until I reflect upon the fact that H.P. Lovecraft, like his creation Cthulhu, never truly died. He and his influence live on in the works of so many of us who were his friends and acolytes. Today we have reason for rejoicing in the widespread revival of his own canon. And if a volume such as this has any justification for his existence, it's because Lovecraft's readers continue to search out stories which reflect his contribution to the field of fantasy. With that in mind, there's no need for further apologia. These tales, poor as some of them may be, nevertheless represent a lifelong homage to HPL, which recently culminated in the publication of my novel, Strange Eons. Taken in that spirit, I hope you'll accept them for what they were and are, a labour of love. There you go. There's a nice little bits of insight in there. I mean, the first thing you take away about it is how self-deprecating Robert Bloch is. It's like he calls the Faceless God, like, stumbling and things like that. I think that's an absolutely tremendous piece of work. I love that. I think that it's an exercise in tension and grimness and all that. But it's nice to hear about that sort of relationship with Lovecraft, isn't it? Because we talk a lot about Lovecraft and Smith on the show because we read a lot of the letters and things like that. So we know a lot more about that. So it's a nice insight into Lovecraft's kind of mentorship of Bloch to a degree. And at the same time, Derleth was doing same. I mean, it's one of my favourite stories about the Circle is actually concerning Robert Bloch and August Derleth. When they first started corresponding, because they both lived in Wisconsin, Derleth invited Robert Bloch round his house. So Bloch did. He went over and knocked on the door, and Derleth opened it wearing a smoking jacket. It's like the epitome of the author, you know what I mean? A smoking jacket and slippers, apparently. It's brilliant, absolutely tremendous. Yeah, so I hope you've enjoyed this, and it's given you a little bit of a glimpse into the worlds of Robert Bloch, something I want to do a bit more of on the show. But basically, we didn't have time to look at all this stuff in the last episode, so this has been a nice excuse to fill the void a little bit. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed what we've looked at today. If you have any thoughts on what we've talked about, or you have any more information about Bloch and the mysteries of the worm that you'd like to share with me, please do so, the usual channels. Thank you to all our listeners and Patreons and the usual bits and pieces. And join us again. I believe next time we're going to be looking at Elizabeth Bear's Shoggoths in Bloom, which, again, is a sort of follow-on from a notebook found in a deserted house. So, with that said, you better hop on the bus before you're stranded in Innsmouth. You don't want that. You don't want that. I believe the Gilman Hotel is actually full tonight, so you'll end up having a crash with Zadok Allen in the back alleys. I'm not sure what's going on, but there was chanting and all that kind of stuff. It's in the run-up to Halloween, right? You don't want to be in town after dark. So with that, it's bye from me, Tim Mendes.